Hello and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts of a. Oh my gosh, I knew I was gonna mess up. Becoming a techno wizard. Maybe I should just put it together. Just call it Thoughts of a Techno Wizard from now on. I don't know. Um, but yes, welcome back to another episode. Today we're going back into Hegel, um, continuing this section on sense certainty, sections 94 through 97 today. But to recap on the last section, my summary of the last section was as follows. In the first chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel breaks down sense certainty as the beginning of the dialectical process of phenomenology. He sets up sense certainty as the truest form of knowledge, an apparent rich and immediate relationship with the world. But he quickly shows how this makes no sense, or at least is not what actually happens. Our senses only ever grant us an immediate instance of knowledge, a surface level perception. The more we look, the more we perceive, thus making it clear that even our most basic senses and certainties gleaned from those senses are still mediated in some way. When we sense things, we perceive a this, and at the same time, we perceive an I, which is another this. Thus, we begin the process of dialectics, where we must compare and contrast each this and formulate an understanding of what we are perceiving. So I hope that's a good kind of summary of the last section. Let's see what Dr. Hegel says. I'm goodness, Dr. Sadler. So he says, let me see. Hegel begins the phenomenology proper in this section, beginning for what seems at first to be the most immediate, most concrete, and truest kind of knowledge, sense certainty, which purports to give us an unmediated consciousness of objects. As it turns out, matters are more complicated than this. Sense certainty turns out to provide an abstract truth in relation to the object, reducing it to a this, and likewise treating consciousness as a pure I, a second this. So we're on point with that. In fact, what we take to be the essence of sense certainty reveals itself as being just an example or instance of it, since sense certainty turns out to be mediated precisely through the I that at first seemed inessential. Yeah. So we were right on point right there. We were right tit for tat on the same accord in terms of how we summarize that last section. So good to hear on that one. That's like one of 20. Well, I did a lot of these, 30 something of these. So maybe like a third of them were close to what, or very close to what Dr. Sadler was saying. But let's jump into this section here. And here we go.
The question must therefore be considered whether in sense certainty itself the object is in fact the kind of essence that sense certainty proclaims it to be, whether this notion of it as the essence corresponds to the way it is present in sense certainty.
So I remember I sped it up last time. I'm going to have to slow it back down because my brain is not ready for such speed. The question must therefore be considered whether in sense certainty itself the object is in fact the kind of essence that sense certainty proclaims it to be, whether this notion of it as this essence corresponds to the way it presents itself in sense certainty. Okay, so I think it's saying, so now that we've kind of established, that sense certainty is mediated and is an instance and doesn't really see everything as it is, we have to ask ourselves, is the object is what we're seeing, is what we're perceiving, the essence of the object, or is it the object as it is, or some other kind of filter, some other understanding or correspondence of the object, of the thing that we're perceiving.
Is it to be? Whether this notion of it as the essence corresponds to the way it is present in sense certainty. To this end, we have not only to reflect on it and ponder what it might be in truth, but only to consider the way in which it is present in sense certainty.
And break that down.
In section 94, which is a very short passage, Hegel is saying, look, now we need to actually formulate our question. We need to think about how we're going to ask this. That's important to figure out exactly what you're asking about. And then how we'll go about resolving that question. What should we do? What shouldn't we do? So really the question there are questions that are being explored here and that are going to be grappled with in the rest of this sense certainty section are these. How is the object really present in sense certainty? What's really going on when we're perceiving something through our senses as immediate, as just what it is? How does that really work? Is it the way that, like I put here, a follow-up question, is it really the way that sense certainty says that it is? You know, the sense certainty's pretense is that I'm just giving you the thing as it is. I'm not adding anything to it. You're not adding anything to it. You're getting the straight thing, unadulterated, pure, just experiential. Is that really what's going on when we're having that kind of relation of knowledge to an object?
Nope.
Now, Hegel is going to frame this a little bit more precisely by saying, does the notion of it as essence, so does the begriff, the concept, what we're able to work out as we're thinking our way through this, as we're following out the twists and turns of what reveal themselves to us in sense certainty, does the notion of it as essence, that is, the object as what is most real, as impinging upon us, as sort of giving itself in its full concreteness, in its true reality to us, the perceivers, does that really correspond to how it is in sense certainty? Or have we made a mistake? Are we misrepresenting to ourselves the way sense certainty works? This is quite important because what he's attacking here is, you might say, the imaginary element in empiricism. Empiricists and people who appeal to common sense are quite often saying, look, things just are the way they are. You just kind of take them in. You're not actually adding anything to them unless you're biased or you're filtering things out. But if you're ready to just take it in as it is, then there's nothing that you're changing in it. Hegel's saying, well, I don't know that that's actually the case. Why don't we look at sense certainty, see what goes on, and see whether it measures up to its own pretensions? Now, he does counsel something that's quite important here at the end of it. He says, we have not to reflect on it and ponder what it might be in truth. We can't do an armchair analysis of this where we just kind of think, what is it like to have a sensory experience? We have to have some basis upon which to work. So there is a kind of empiricism going on here, but it's an empiricism that's more radical than the typical empiricism, even the ones that call themselves radical empiricism. He says we have to consider the way in which it really is present in sense certainty. So we need to look at how sense certainty works.
Mm-hmm. And all the while I'm getting him thinking is, and this is kind of gonna get off topic a little bit, but I think this is useful to kind of share my own thoughts and kind of hot topic ideas and stuff like that. So just earlier today, like right before this, I got distracted because I have a million tabs up here, and I got distracted reading one of these tabs that I saved for later, in which they were getting mad at this group. They were getting mad at the Nature Human Behavior science group or magazine or whatever, for having this publishing where it says science must respect the dignity and rights of all humans, right? And through it, it's like an ethics guideline for putting out scientific research, right? Saying that, you have to be careful. Basically, you have to be careful what we put out and how we put it out, right? Because certain scientific, studies may basically justify, really terrible behavior. And we have to be really careful of that. And that's just really simplifying it. But they go through this article, right? And the people against it were like, oh, this is terrible. This is science trying to be politically correct and blah, 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 blah. Right? And I say it like that because it really frustrates me, because this is exactly the problem here, right? Is that there's this idea in a lot of science that science automatically kind of is looking at the truth, right? If you take this idea of empiricism, for instance, right, to relate it to this section, and it's very much like this sense certainty, right? Where with science, just like with our perceptions, there's this assumption that what we're measuring and what we're studying is the objective truth, especially if we have good methodology, right? if we have certain sampling and certain population amount and all this other stuff, right? If we have good methodology, then there's this assumption that we're going to get this objective fact, this objective truth, and that we can then act upon this truth and treat it as empirical, treat it as objective. But the fundamental problem with that, right, is the fact that our own senses, our perceptions, and our tools that we create based on our perceptions inherently bias, right, what we look at, inherently even filter, inherently change, inherently, have some effect on the world that we're looking at. And even if we have a good methodology, right, it still doesn't necessarily mean that we are automatically being objective, right, in the purest sense. Because even the idea of objective reality is up to interpretation, right? We don't actually know for sure if there is an objective reality, if there's a reality that exists outside of ourselves that is completely, devoid of perception of all these other things and and so on and so forth, right? We don't actually know that. We function as if objective reality might be true, right? And it is useful to assume, some of these things, but we don't actually know. But unfortunately, a lot of science, especially the scientific people of a certain bent, right? The type of people who think that politics is separate from science, the type of people who think social science is not a real science, these types of people tend to ignore that core fundamental aspect of reality that we don't actually 100% know what's objective, right? They tend to ignore that, and so they hold up this idea of empiricism, of methodology as the ultimate truth, as science as the ultimate truth, and all that. While at the same time, we have this we have the underlying issue that we don't actually know exactly what we're looking at. And so when people are like, "Hey, maybe we should be careful of scientific, studies that could lead to really terrible actions," right? Because this is exactly how eugenics was so popular in the early 1900s. It's because people thought that they were being purely objective, right? But of course, there's an underlying bias where every scientist, or almost all the scientists, were in and of themselves of a certain caste, of a certain part of society, right? And so they were not even able to see or perceive or admit, the other parts of society. And so when they were doing studies that they thought were empirical and and had good methodology and all this other stuff, they were creating extremely biased studies, and their own tools were not able to measure the bias of those studies. They weren't able to critique the bias of their own studies. How could they? That was their perception of the world, right? That was their idea. They thought they were being objective. And so to me, when I see people today say, "Oh, why are you being politically correct? Why are you blah blah? Why are you trying to get politics into science?" They're fundamentally naive, because they're and arrogant at the same time, because they're kind of assuming that just because we got better at science means that suddenly our science is purely perfect, right? When in reality it's not. And I'm sure everybody would admit that, yes, science is not perfect. But for some reason, those people are not able to admit that it's going to take some that yeah, we should be careful of the science that we think we're being objective about, because it may turn out that we are wrong, right? That what we thought is purely objective, that what we thought had great methodology, in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years, we might find out that it was completely wrong, and and it caused extreme, terrible actions, just like what we found out in the last century, right? So to me, it just makes sense that we should be more careful about how we think about our science, right? That we shouldn't think about it as purely objective, um, because we don't actually know what objective is. We don't actually know if the universe is objective, and so there's always going to have to be this caution around what we think to be true and what we think to be facts it may be objective in a contextual, subjective sense, right? Like today, it seems to be the best objective truth, but tomorrow it might be wrong if we figure out something new. And so I really like this because it gets us thinking about whether or not, what we see today as empiricism or as our perceptions and things like that really is, what we think it is. But sorry, that was just on my mind, and I just had to share it because it was just weird how this, colluded. Um, I don't know. Maybe you think that was completely unnecessary, but whatever.
It is then sense certainty itself that must be asked. What is the this? If we take the this in the twofold shape that's being as now and as here, the dialectic it has in it will receive a form as intelligible as the this itself is. To the question, what is now? It
That
will
was a little
receive
confusing. A lot of this there. You got to pay attention. It is this then certainty self that must be asked. What is the this? If we take the this in the twofold shape of its being as now and as here, the dialectic has in it it has in it will receive a form as intelligible as the this itself is. Okay, yeah.
a form as intelligible as the this itself is. To the question, what is now? Let us answer. For example, now is night. In order to test the truth of this sense certainty, a simple experiment will suffice. We write down this truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, we shall have to say that it has become stale.
So it kind of gives you that understanding that, truth kind of changes based on like when we're looking at it, or the idea that facts. There's this, I wish I remember the quote, but my teacher used to say this quote all the time back in high school. Like facts are like the signposts on the highway of knowledge or something like that, where basically saying like facts seem like the truth as we're going, but they're kind of stationary, right? Like you said, they become stale because as you move along, as you learn more, you realize what you thought was fact was just fact for that moment. Now you have this new fact, which goes with what I was saying before. Like at every point in time, we think we're being factual and completely objective, whatever, but then later on we realize something else and we learn something more, and what we thought was fact was not fact, or was only fact at that time, or whatever.
Section 95, Hegel is going to actually ask sense certainty, what's going on here? Tell me about how the object actually is for you. This. What is the this? What is the object that you say is so independent, is the essential thing, that the I doesn't really matter, that knowledge is merely of the object? Well, what is this? And it arrives in a sort of doubled form. And this makes sense when we think about the ways in which we perceive things. In general, we perceive a now at this time. Of course, it's rather difficult, and we're going to see that you can't actually hold on to a now. And then in space, a here. Not over there, but here. When we're having an experience, and it's presenting it to us in this sort of, supposedly unmediated way, we're conscious of the now and here. We say that we're present in the moment, and the moment includes both, a spatial and a temporal sort of dimension to them. But then we can ask, that's fine. What's now? Now notice what has to happen. Sense certainty has to specify something about the now. It also is going to have to specify something about the here. So, we could pick anything we want. We could say that, well, the time itself determines it, and so it imposes itself upon us, but, we can also sort of in our imagination say, well, let's pick 5 o'clock or 10 o'clock or, make up whatever we want. Hegel goes with night. Now is night. As a matter of fact, as I'm recording that, that's not the case, but perhaps while you're watching that, that is the case. And here's where we get to what's really important in this. He says, in order to test the truth of this sense certainty, and notice what he's doing. We're taking certainty, Gewissheit, and we want to test the truth of it. You might say, well, why would you test the truth of certainty? I mean, what it means to be certain about something is you don't need to test the truth of it because you already know that it's true. You're certain of it. Well, no, you're not. Because if you really were, then you wouldn't be so defensive when somebody says, how can you be certain of your certainty? How do you know that your certainty is true?
Mm-hmm.
That defensiveness is itself a sort of affective correlate to an epistemological problem. How do we know the truth of sense certainty? We say that it's night, and we can test it. So he says, we write down this truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down. We've written it down right here, right? It's being imposed through pixels on your screen, whatever it is that you're watching this upon. We write down this truth. The truth cannot lose anything by being written down, any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it, through our remembering it, through our keeping it going in language. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, what happens? Is it night right now? If it's noon, it's not. So this doesn't have a truth anymore. And what's really interesting about this passage, Hegel doesn't say, oh yeah, now it's just become false. Truth is just a correlate to falsity, and it sort of fluctuates back and forth. You know, sort of like the example of a broken watch is right twice a day, because it's going to sooner or later wind up at that point. He says that this truth has now become stale. It's become shal. It's become outworn. It's become outmoded. It no longer works for us. It's insipid. So what's going on here? Notice what Hegel has done. He's forced us to specify in sense certainty just what the this is supposed to be. Now we're stuck with a now and a here, and whenever we have a now, we have to pick a particular now, and that makes us a bit vulnerable to that now no longer being what it was that we thought it was. And we're doing this just by unpacking what's going on in sense certainty.
So it shows us that truth has to be dynamic, or at least, you know, as we learn things like our perceptions, how we see the world, you know, how we measure the world, how we understand the world, has to be dynamic, has to be a constant, you know, process. That's awesome.
The now that is night is preserved. That is, it is treated as what it professes to be, as something that is. But it proves itself to be, on the contrary, something that is not. The now does indeed preserve itself, but is something that is not night. Equally, it preserves itself in the face of the day that it now is, as something also that is not day. In other words, as a negative in general. This self-preserving now is therefore not immediate, but mediated. For it is determined as a permanent and self-preserving now through the fact that something else, that is day and night, is not. And so determined, it is still just as simply now as before, and in the simplicity is indifferent to what happens in it. Just as little as day and night are its being, just as much also is it day and night. It is not in the least affected by this its other being. A simple thing of this kind, which is, through negation, which is neither this nor that, a not this, and is with equal indifference this as well as that, such a thing we call a universal. So it is, in fact, the universal that is the true content of sense certainty. So it is, in fact, with equal indifference.
Simple thing of this kind, which is through the negation, which is neither this nor that, a not this, and is with equal indifference this as well as that. Such a thing we call it. Okay, yeah. So it's like when we think of a concept, we're also thinking of what it's not, what the concept is not. And because of that, because we're holding these kind of contradictions, we're thinking about it in terms of the universal. From what I understand, I forget exactly what he was talking about, the universe before, but for what I can kind of glean from this, the universal is like a concept that can apply in different situations, right? And it's universal not because it's always true, but because it's true in different contexts, right? Or something like that. I don't know. I may be wrong on that.
This as well as that. Such a thing we call a universal. So it is, in fact, the universal that is the true content of sense certainty.
In section 96, we're arriving at another critical juncture where we're going to get the introduction of the universal. So let's see how we actually get there. Again, we're watching to see what happens within sense certainty when we interrogate it about how it actually plays out. You know, when you're dealing with a here or a now, what does that determinately mean for the consciousness that's supposed to be purely immediate? So if we think about the preservation that's going on of the night that no longer exists because now it's day, Hegel says that the now that is night is preserved. It is kept in play. It's treated as what it professes to be, as something that is. So we have now is night is something that is in a certain sense. But we know that that's not actually the whole story. Notice that I didn't say not actually the case. just not the whole story, because it's also something that is not, because it is day. So now is night, and that's preserved in a certain way, and now is also not night because it's day. And we can change the polarities if we want. We can change it to day and say that day does the same thing when it goes to nighttime or when it's twilight or whatever you want to bring up. So where do we go from here? He says the now does preserve itself. Here's where a key transition is taking place. The now preserves itself, but is something that is not night. Equally preserves itself in the face of the day that it now is as something that also is not day. Now is greater than night or day. Now could be either one of them, and it can go back and forth. So now is actually something that is different from night and is different from day. And here we get into some really interesting logic. You might say, well, it's got to be one or the other. No, it doesn't. Could be dawn. Well, dawn is part of day. Well, if you want to quibble that sort of thing, we can always keep introducing more and more distinctions. And you're still going to wind up with the same problem. Even if you added in 3 possibilities or 10 possibilities, you'd have the same dialectic taking place. So he says, it's not night and it's not day. In other words, it is a negative in general. So what we took to be pure turns out to be something negative.
Connection.
Turns out to be something that's almost empty. Just wait. The self-preserving now.
Connection is messing up. So sorry. But yeah, I like this idea. It's a good pause anyways. The idea, like I said before, is like the universal is not something that is necessarily always true, or maybe it is, but it's like it's true in different concepts, and that like you can apply it to different concepts, right? I don't know. Let's see what he's going to say about it. It seems very. I like this avenue.
Is not immediate, but mediated, for it is determined as a permanent and self-preserving now. We'll look at that in a moment. So determined as a self-preserving now, the fact that something else is not. So this is a mediation. This is a mediation. The now, as a negation, possesses more being or is more essential than either one of these 2 determinate qualities or quantities or whatever you want to call them, whatever modality you want to ascribe to them. So he says the self-preserving now is a permanent and self-preserving now through the fact that something else is not. And so determined, it is just as simply now as before. And this simplicity is indifferent to what happens in it. So it can contain day or it can contain night, but it doesn't care.
That's
the remain
universal.
Now just as much
other ideas,
when it's day as when it's night. It doesn't really matter as far as the now is concerned what content you want to shove in there. It'll continue being this now forever. It is purely simple.
That's beautiful.
Let's go on. So he says, just as little as day and night are its being, just as much also is it day and night. So there's something paradoxical being said here. Day and night are not the being of the now, nor are, say, noon and midnight, or any particular hour of the day, and yet it is those things at the same time. Now, doesn't that strike you as a little bit strange? Doesn't that seem to violate the law of non-contradiction? A thing can't be and not be in the same way at the same time. Or can it? There's one kind of thing that Hegel says does that.
Universal.
A universal. A universal both is the thing of which it is the things of which it is a universal, and it is not them. It relates itself to them in a way that both negates them and enfolds them into itself. That allows them to be the content for it, and says, you're not the whole show. I'm the main show. I'm the thing that gives you what you are. You contribute mere determinacy. I contribute essence. I contribute what it is to be what you are.
Oh my gosh. And if I could jump ahead over here. Probably what might be getting into later in this book, right? This is what makes the concept of like God and like consciousness so appealing and so powerful, right? Is this it's like the ultimate universal, and perhaps this is why this book is so important in terms of like the spirit of phenomenology, right? Because again, we're saying, I think what he was saying in the intro was like this: what is the spirit, right? Why like you call it consciousness, you can call it all these other things, but there's this idea that you have this larger concept, um, and it seems to encapsulate so much, and yet seems to not exist, seems to not be these different things. So you have this inherent contradiction, this inherent negation, um, and by understanding these universals, by understanding these concepts that exist and don't exist, that are more intuitive and more just immediate, but at the same time are mediations of everything else, it allows us to better understand how we see the world and how we perceive the world, and what we consider as the most important things, and all this other stuff. And this can really help to explain concepts like God, because it shows that this concept of a higher power, of a creator, whatever, could be this universal concept, right? This universal where it contains everything, and yet it is not those things, and yet it is. Not because of some even though it seems like a contradiction, and it is, but it's also something that is still very true, right? Like, even from a non-religious standpoint, if you just think about the fact that we are parts of the universe, right? We are made of these star stuff, right? We are made of all these elements and things like that, and which comes from the universe, and is the universe, right? So we are the universe, but we are not the entirety of the universe. We're just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a point, and yet we can call ourselves the universe, and the universe is us. But it's not just some you know woohoo idea. It's a real fundamental truth that we are a part of the universe, right? And at the same time, we are not the universe, and because of that, we can analyze it, we can learn about it, we can uh, uh, self-assess, we can learn these things, we can build this understanding of what the universe is, because of our vantage point. And that's what makes it so interesting, that we can build these stories and these ideas of the world and stuff like that. I don't know, maybe I'm not making any sense, but to me it's just really fascinating.
So he goes on and he says, a simple thing of this kind, which is through negation, which is neither, in this case, this, nor that, and not this, and it is with equal indifference also this and that. Such a thing we call a universal. So what do we have here? Sense certainty was supposed to be about concrete things. It was supposed to be about the immediate experience, not about universals. But this shows us that the truth of sense certainty is indeed the universal. That's what sense certainty really is providing us with when we start digging down into it and paying attention to what's going on.
Beautiful.
It is as a universal that we utter what the sensuous content is. When what we say is this, that is the universal this, or it is, that is being in general. Of course, we do not envisage the universal this or being in general, but we utter the universal. In other words, we do not strictly say what in the sense certainty we mean to say. But language, as we see, is the more truthful. In it, we ourselves directly refute what we mean to say. And since the universal is the true content of sense certainty, and language expresses this true content alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean.
Hey,
Immediately,
there go my partner right there in the chat. Welcome, baby. Watching me trying to learn some nerdy stuff. Very happy to have you. So yeah, I really like this section here, because it shows us that the language is so interesting, in that very rarely do we mean what we say, right? A lot of what we say is sort of abstractions of what we mean. But at the same time, it it shows we communicate the world as we see it. So we do mean what we say, but we often don't know what we mean, or it could be something like that, right? It could be this dance in between, like how we see the universe and how we try to communicate it, right? How we communicate, or how we try to communicate what we mean, at the same time as how that doesn't necessarily achieve that, but at the same time does allow us this opportunity to have this dialectic, to have this conversation, to have this understanding of, you know, try to test our certainties and try to test our perceptions in order to build, that up. I find that really, really
After
cool.
hitting us with this realization that sense certainty involved something that we didn't think that it did, namely the universal, which seemed to be exactly the opposite of what sense certainty and kind of experience and knowledge that it promised us was all about. Hegel's going to hit us with yet another major revelation, which is that language is at the very heart of what's going on here, and that this opposition that we have here between language is dealing with the universal and the sense certainty is dealing with the particular really is not going to hold, in part because language is at the core of the truth of sense certainty, just as much as the universal is. There's a paradoxicality to sense certainty, which is that it cannot be what it promised originally. It has to be something that seems exactly at the opposite end of the spectrum from it. But this is what dialectical analysis shows us. So he says, it is as a universal that we utter what the sensuous content is. So before we go into the more abstract universal this, let's think about what happens when we are using language. So we have this relationship now between consciousness, the pure I, and the object, the sensuous content over here. And the relationship is one of knowledge. Sense certainty is supposed to be immediate knowledge. We've seen that it's not really immediate, but let's just say that for the time being that is, because we don't need to contest that. When we speak about it, when we express or utter what that thing over there is, like when we said here, or said day or night as part, when we say now, said day or night as part of the now. Later on it's going to be tree and other things instead of here. As soon as we begin speaking, not just thinking, but speaking. As soon as we begin using language, we are dealing with the universal. As we've seen, the universal is interesting because it is at the same time an affirmation and a negation of all of the particulars that universal relates itself to. It is not those particulars, and yet it also is those particulars. In some ways, it's more those particulars than those particulars are themselves. This is all relations of mediation, as we've just seen in previous discussions. So as soon as consciousness begins treating the sensuous content as something particular, it also has to universalize it in order to make sense of it. So it's not so receptive or immediate as we originally took it to be. That's not what's going on in sense certainty. Because if you can ask somebody, what are you watching? What are you looking at? What do you taste? And they're able to respond with anything, as soon as they respond, they're engaging with the universal. How does that chocolate taste? Good, sweet, bitter. Those are universals. Taste chocolatey, that's universal. What are you watching? A bunch of birds. Now, you didn't describe, I see 41 birds and they're, arranged in all these ways, because you can't do that in language. Language works by means of universalizing, of making things less concrete, more abstract. But it's through that we're able to have the concrete as concrete. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to understand it.
Yeah.
So let's go on now. He says, what about the this, the universal this? Well, that is being in general. Now we're not just talking about one thing, we're talking about beings as such. We're doing metaphysics here. He says, we don't envisage the universalness or being in general. That's a really interesting thing to think about. What is the universalness? What is being in general? What does it taste like? How does it impress itself upon you? Let's get away from sense things and let's talk about feelings. What's your feeling about being?
We give like these approximations.
We have that sort of thing. It's something that we can speak, something that we can think, but it's not something that we can perceive through the senses. So sense perception, sense certainty has led us away from the senses as such. He says we don't envisage the universal this or being in general. We utter the Aussagen. We utter the universal. We don't strictly say what in this sense certainty we mean to say. So language by its very nature does tend to conceal or to distort or to change the thing that it's trying to express. But it's the only game in town. It's the only way you are going to express it. So when somebody asks you about the sensuous content, you have to respond in language, thereby universalizing it, thereby mediating it, thereby changing it to a certain extent, thereby making sense certainty something very different than what it purported to be. So he says language is actually more truthful. Sense certainty showed us that it's kind of deceptive. It isn't really certainty. It doesn't really provide the most concrete truth. It really leads us into other things. Language, though, is more truthful. Why? We directly refute what we mean to say. And since the universal is the true content of sense certainty, and language expresses this true content alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean. We're confronted with a limit that we can't actually express with the universals of language or thought, exactly what it is that we are experiencing, exactly what we are perceiving as receptive, beings sensuously engaged with the world of experience. We're already distorting it just by the mere fact of naming things. But like I said, that's the only game in town. Sense certainty has, under investigation, shown us to be the case. So language is in a certain respect more truthful because of that. It says the universal is the true content of sense certainty. Now, notice one other thing that we're going to sort of close with as we get ready to move into some even deeper discussions.
Let's get it.
Where have we posed this impossibility of ever truly saying what it is that we intend in terms of the particular? Where have we laid that problematic out? You might say, on the chalkboard, Dr. Sadler. But how have I done that? This is all language. Sure, there's a few, arrows and things like that, but those are symbols as well. They're supposed to represent relations. It is in language that we are able to represent to ourselves and grasp the truth of the impossibility of, with language, grasping the truth of the sensuous particular. Which means that the sensuous particular, as such, is an abstraction that has been brought into the realm of language, into the realm of thought, into the realm of the concept, the Hegelian Begriff. What we've seen happen here is that sense certainty has been aufgehoben. It's been, you can call it sublation or transcended. We're moving away from anything like a pure sense certainty, and now we're in the realm of language.
Yeah, because even our perceptions, right, in these days depend on our language, depend on how it's communicated to us that perception works, and that's very interesting, right? Is that maybe we can imagine a time, right, before language when we sense things, when we perceive the universe or the world or whatever, on an objective state or without much mediation, without language. But without the language, you wouldn't be able to communicate what you perceive, and therefore you wouldn't have any sort of certainty about what you're perceiving, right? Because we specified that even if you have this pure conception, this pure perception of the world, it's not the complete truth, right? Because once again, like if I'm looking at a cup or a rock, right? If I'm looking at a rock, let's take something that's just raw, right? If I'm looking at a rock, it's not sure exactly what I'm looking at. Like what type of rock is it? Like what can I do with that rock? Can I bash somebody in the head with it, or is it going to break apart? Can I turn it into a tool or not, right? Like just looking at the rock, just perceiving it isn't really going to get you much information. You have to delve deeper into it. You have to test it. You have to do things with it. And as people, as creatures with some level of intelligence in which we can pick up this rock and wonder more about it, we also want to communicate that with other people like us. And so that communication, is a language. Even if we have a unrefined language of just guttering, of just you know that in and of itself requires some mediation, some filtering, some okay, this is a this, look at this concept, this rock, and I can give it to you, right? That requires some level of mediation for you to other this thing, for you to separate yourself from that thing, right? Because otherwise, that's probably why we don't see other animals just passing along other objects as tools, right? And this is why we see when a certain animal uses a an object as a tool, we say, "Oh wow, this is amazing. They have tool making abilities." Even if they're just using a stick to poke a ant pile, we're like, "Oh, this is tool making ability," because that means that you are able to that they are able to separate themselves. They are able to form an idea of the self, an idea of the this, right? Like this is an object, and I can use it for other things than what's just used for. And of course, you have different levels of this, right? You see different animals, maybe they only use, a branch to clear their teeth, right? While others can pick up that branch and then stick a hole in it, while others can take that branch and whack somebody with it, right? Like you have these varying levels of ability of abstracting an idea and forming a separate concept. But that abstraction requires that mediation. And so it's just by the concept of being conscious requires some level of subjectivity or mediation or whatever you want to call it. And that's really important to recognize. It's really important to to notice. So yeah, I love this stuff. I really like this book. And yeah, I'm excited to get to the next section. I might go on today. I don't know, probably not, but maybe. So as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you learned today, what you think about this series and this section and all this good stuff. And yeah, have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.